Hmm?
I see you're reading the Scrum guide there, Duncan. How many pages is that?
Oh, this, the
Hmm,
Scrum Guide, 19 pages.
19 pages. That sounds pretty easy to learn.
Yeah, it is generally considered simple to understand.
Okay. But is it easy to master?
That's an excellent question. And I would say definitely not.
Hmm.
A lot of people do say that, come on, the Scrum Guide's only 19 pages.
You
How
certainly say
difficult?
that, yes.
I do try and say that a lot. How difficult can it be? And the answer is, well, it's not that difficult to get an understanding, a fundamental understanding of what Scrum is. But that doesn't mean that you'll find it easy or simple to implement that within your team or your organization.
So a lot of stuff that's easy to learn is actually difficult to put into practice. And that's what we find with Scrum, difficult to make it work in the real world, difficult to master it, yeah?
Absolutely. So all of the Scrum framework is based on empiricism, transparency, inspection, and adaptation. So that means in order to be effective with Scrum, your team is wanting to encourage as much transparency as possible. Transparency over problems, transparency over progress, transparency over dysfunctions within the team and within the organization. And the thing is that most organizations are set up to disincentivize the team from raising these problems. So that's going to be really tricky to implement, even if you understand that that's what you should be doing.
Transparency gives us this basis for inspecting as well. And inspecting is the easier part, but the adaptation is the more difficult part. Making it stick. It's like a diet. Like we start off with the best of intentions, but if we don't stick to those changes, keep making them, we don't get the benefits. Scrum's kind of like that if we inspect without adapting, we don't get the benefits. And that's one of the reasons it's difficult to master, because change is difficult. Making change stick is hard.
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about small changes to maybe the plan for the day or the week. If you're using Scrum properly, you're trying to inspect and adapt perhaps the whole culture of the organization, how the organization works at a fundamental level. And people resist change. People don't like change. So you're constantly going to be pushing people outside of their comfort zones.
We aim for these lots of small incremental changes. It can be difficult to keep track of all of those. It's easy to let them slip.
Yes.
Okay. Why else is it difficult to master? Or is that it? Is it just because change is difficult? No one likes change.
I think that's probably a huge part of it. That's big enough, isn't it? But also there are a lot of concepts in there which seem simple, which may be seeing common sense, but which are maybe not common practice, certainly. For example, what about the Scrum team, or at least the development team, being self-organizing? A lot of people will say, okay, yeah, so the Scrum team self-organized, but what does that mean? It gives you no instruction as to how a self-organizing team should work. What are the challenges you're going to come across with a self-organizing team of 4 or 5 or 9 or 10 people? And as that team works through its storming and norming and performing phases, as a Scrum Master, what are all the different techniques you're going to have to be aware of?
What does good self-organization look like? Like the guide tells us that we need to do this, but what does that actually look like? How do we know if a team is self-organizing well, or if what they're doing is actually detrimental to what they're trying to achieve?
And I don't think a lot of Scrum Masters will even have consensus over what good self-organization looks like.
And how about cross-functionality while we're on the subject as well? Everyone's expected to chip in, perhaps step outside of their comfort zone and take collective accountability for the output of the team, for the value the team are delivering to our customers. Accepting collective accountability, accepting that any task the team take on is the responsibility of the whole team to get done. That can be difficult too.
You've glossed over a lot of fundamental changes there. You have to rearrange your teams if they're in a more traditional format so that they are cross-functional. You'll then have to change the culture so that the individual team members start having that accountability. And then for that to work, all of the team will need to embrace those Scrum values, that culture change. All of that can take weeks and months or maybe even years. That isn't something you can just read the Scrum guide, click your fingers and expect it to happen.
You mentioned the Scrum values there, and that's true because doing Scrum well requires a mindset change. It's not just a change to what we do. It can be a change to the way we think about work, changing attitudes to embrace the Scrum values: courage, focus, commitment, respect, openness. That's difficult. Attitude shift takes time, takes commitment, takes focus. That's why it's difficult to master too.
And there's either an...
blah. Talking is difficult.
Talking is difficult for some people.
So we talked about Scrum values there, but also value. Like throughout the Scrum guide, it mentions we want to deliver the most value to our customers. But value is an abstract concept. What actually is value? It's different things to different people. And deciding or understanding what value is difficult. How do we know what value means to our customers? And how can we ensure that we're actually delivering this abstract thing? That's difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a challenge for the product owner, working with the Scrum Master to actually decide what the team should be working on. So that's a whole different way of working, this value-based prioritization. But the development team, they also need to work in a completely different way. Scrum isn't just having this silly 15-minute meeting every day and then everything else returns to normal. The way that the development team work has also turned on its head, because they're working in this iterative and incremental way getting to done. And that's really tough as well.
And how about the fear of failure, overcoming that fear of failure for development team members? That's tough as well. They're probably going to be used to failure being a bad thing. Embracing the fact that we can try new stuff and it might work or it might not. That's not easy as well. That's another attitude shift.
Yeah, you've got the experimentation side, which is encouraged with Scrum. But you've also got the fact that rather than one far off deadline, you've now got a lot of much closer deadlines in your sprints that you're expected to deliver. You're accountable for delivering every couple of weeks, and it's very visible if you don't. So that's a huge change for the team.
Now, how about the fact too that Scrum teams are encouraged to inspect and adapt and find better ways of working, but that Scrum itself is immutable and non-negotiable. We want to inspect and adapt everything, but we can't inspect and adapt Scrum itself. That's difficult, that distinction, that demarcation. What's okay to change, what's okay to add, and what is not? That's confusing to new teams particularly.
And I guess the point is that Scrum covers the absolute basics. It's a framework. It's not a methodology. There's not that much detail in it. These are the absolute minimum roles, events, and artifacts for you to be successful being empirical. And then we're back all the way at the beginning of the conversation. It's all about transparency, inspection, and adaptation. And I think that's why Scrum is so difficult to master.
The temptation to change stuff is really difficult to resist. There's bits of Scrum that are harder than other bits, and the temptation to let them slide, just to not do them. Let's not invite the customers to the review because that's difficult for a whole bunch of reasons.
That's difficult questions.
Yeah, and we have to show them stuff, and then they ask for more stuff, and then we have to focus on quality while delivering more stuff. The temptation to just stop doing some things or sideline them, that's difficult. That takes what does that take? I can't think of the word. It takes something.
It does take something.
It does take something. It takes something indescribable.
Indescribable by you, certainly.
It takes commitment, Dunk. That's what it takes.
That's one of the Scrum values. Maybe you should.
Is it?
Yeah. But yeah, certainly, if you're going to do Scrum, then you're going to have to change your organization. But it is a lot easier to change Scrum, which is essentially what you were saying, trying to say.
Yeah, just better. So how about a quick analogy then? So I think of Scrum like chess. Like the rules of chess are pretty straightforward to learn, but it is a difficult game to master. We can understand how to play the game, but it takes practice, it takes experience, it takes time to actually play the game well. Scrum is the same thing. The rules are fairly simple, but it takes practice and time to actually do this stuff well in the real world once we come up against a real opponent.
It's interesting. Scrum Guide is, in its current format, 19 pages. And people will say, well, how on earth can you spend 2 days on a training course talking about 19 pages? but certainly the rules of chess are what, 24 pages, but no one would expect you to read those 24 pages and to become a chess grandmaster overnight.
Or perhaps read those 24 pages and be able to sit down and play a game of chess.
Yes.
Yeah, I suspect. Which is very similar to the Scrum course. Like, can you just hit the ground running and do Scrum after reading 17 pages? Probably not. I don't know, maybe. Who knows?
Okay, so Scrum like chess.
Easy to learn, difficult to master.
Or is it?
Or is it? Is it even easy to learn, Duncan? Is Scrum easy to learn? There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of bad Scrum out there. And there's a lot of wrong Scrum out there. Sometimes often teams, have been exposed to bad Scrum. They've said, yeah, I've done Scrum in the past. Overcoming or relearning, unlearning the bad habits that they've learned, that can be really difficult. So is it difficult to learn, or is it easy?
I'd say
is it even easy to learn.
It's difficult to master and not even particularly easy to understand. As you say, I'm sure you've come across this when you've been explaining Scrum, and people will say, well, that's not Scrum, or that's not how we do Scrum here. And they'll deny your interpretation of what Scrum is because their experience is different, even though they haven't really been doing Scrum. So there's probably a lot more bad Scrum out there than we would like to admit.
We must unlearn what we have learned. So if we were going to wrap this up, Scrum, possibly easy to learn, but maybe not. Definitely difficult to master for a whole bunch of reasons in the real world. It's a lot easier in theory than it is to implement in practice. As Einstein said, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're very different.
Yeah, we can all read about transparency and inspection and adaptation, but the reality is most people read the Scrum guide and they see that it's a 15-minute meeting every day and organizing work into sprints, and they think, I can do that. But they don't think about what's important, which is that transparency, about every conversation being open and honest, non-judgmental, and accepting sometimes that teams fail and using that information to make real change. That, of course, is incredibly difficult because people just don't like change.
Making these small incremental improvements and keeping that ball rolling, keeping that process going, and building on, just as when we build the increment, we build upon all the previous work that we've done. When we're inspecting and adapting how we work, we build on all of those changes. It's really difficult to keep improving. It takes motivation. It takes intrinsic motivation. Teams have to want to do this. You can't tell a team to do Scrum. Teams have to want to do this. That's tricky.
Yeah, that's ScrumChat.
ScrumChat.